Protests over the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza have taken over several college campuses, most notably Columbia University, Yale, and NYU, which has caused the schools to take action through policy that some say is infringing on students' rights to assemble and to free speech.
As demonstrations have intensified, schools are trading in free speech protection for what they call safety, risking students' rights to assemble and freely express themselves. Here to discuss how free speech has come under attack is First Amendment attorney and director of campus rights advocacy, Alex Morey. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me.
Alex, what is your read, first off, about what is happening on these campuses? Obviously, the students are making a substantive case for their values here, not just a free speech case. But what are the limits of what is allowed and not allowed at a university like, say, Columbia?
Right. So from a legal standpoint, Columbia makes First Amendment-like free speech promises. So we definitely want students to be able to engage in peaceful protest and faculty. We want to see faculty being able to speak out on matters of public concern. The really tricky thing in the last week or so has been here with that encampment at Columbia. Typically, time, place, and manner regulations are allowed in even open areas of campus where normally you'd be able to see a lot of protest, right? So things like using amplified sound or erecting big structures, or as we're seeing here, camping out for days on end. Typically, those are against the rules. But of course, with Columbia, we've had Columbia go before Congress in recent days, suggesting that they are more than willing to crack down on pro-Palestinian speech, calling it, quote unquote, anti-Semitic. And so it has raised questions about, is this your cut and dry case of, cracking down on civil disobedience, or is there something more going on here?
And obviously the police have been summoned in some of these situations to deal with what's going on. How should campuses handle that? Obviously there's been calls, there's been legislators, members of Congress saying, send in the National Guard, send in the troops, et cetera. It sounds like what you're saying is even if there are infractions taking place of some policy, these are, campus policy infractions, and these are should not be seen as criminal infractions. They have the right to peacefully protest. So how should universities be dealing with the situation, as tricky as it might be?
Yeah, on the one hand, as the free speech lady, I want to say, the right time for Columbia to start teaching its students and emboldening its students to understand and exercise their free expression rights and their free expression responsibilities in the most effective way was a decade ago. That's not happening, so let's deal with what's happening here. We can't have free speech on campuses until we have physical safety on campuses. We can't have free speech on campuses until we have everybody following viewpoint neutral, evenly applied, non-viewpoint discriminatory rules. So what we need to see from Columbia now is a return to first practices and say, we are going to apply our very robust free expression policy. We're not going to crack down on speech we see that's controversial, but we are going to make sure that everybody's following the same rules. So they may have gotten to a point where, I think they frankly have gotten to a point where they do need to bring in police to clear this encampment, but they should do it in a really transparent and, free speech first kind of way where they're saying, look, not that we want to silence these students, but we really care about free expression. We really care about making sure these students who are in this encampment are able to express their views, but we have to also make sure that the university is able to function in a meaningful way and that students who might disagree with the students in the encampment are also allowed to access the campus. So again, tricky situation, one I think Columbia and schools like it, right, that have really put free speech on the back burner for many years now. I think they could have avoided this by teaching their students about free expression, making sure students that they lean into situations like this where students have really important things to say about the issues of the day instead of trying to censor students who are saying controversial things, instead giving students more resources, more support, more education on how to make their voices heard. That will help avoid getting to situations like we're at now, where we're seeing violence on campus and police in riot gear, which is something, for those of us who watch the free speech campus space, those are the darkest days, right? We never want to see this. We never want to see it get to this, because violence is the antithesis of free expression.
Just to be clear, there have been can you speak to any reported incidents of any students on campus, not unaffiliated outsiders, who have engaged in any violence at these events?
So that's a really good question. We have had allegations of violence, and we are working to, confirm those. We had, what we have seen that appears to be on campus and potentially involving students are situations where students are, blockading people from moving across campus. When you are, linking arms and causing, shoving people, making sure they're not getting past you, that can cross the line into blocking ingress or egress in a way that is assault, right? The definition of assault is putting someone in fear of an unconsented touching. So that's kind of a low bar, and you might get there when you are linking arms and kind of maneuvering around like that on campus. There are also allegations that someone got poked in the eye with a flagpole at one of these protests. We're looking for video that would confirm that. And then, of course, right off campus at Columbia, where there's no
New York
separate
City,
campus.
right?
They're in the middle of
once you
city.
get into the middle of New York City, then of course anything can happen, but that has nothing to do with the responsibilities of the peaceful protesters at Columbia. But what I really wanted to get to was some hypocrisy that some people believe exists between the way the Charlottesville protesters were handled and the contemporary pro-Palestine peaceful protesters are being handled. When one of the Charlottesville protesters was very prominently featured in photos and film of that event, it turns out he was a student at LSE at the same time that Columbia's current president was at LSE. At the time, it seemed like the narrative was, well, these people have the right to protest, even if they're protesting, you will not replace us. Some people, there's a debate about whether or not they were saying Jews will not replace us or you will not replace us. Either way, holding tiki torches and walking what many people felt like was a threatening way, and they might have feared for their safety on campus. At that time, the narrative was that they had the right to do so. I think that's probably correct, but it does seem like there's an asymmetry now, Manoush Shafik being central in both of these instances between how these students are treated. What do you make of that comparative analysis?
Well, I do think what's really interesting is that she's now got Congress breathing down her neck, right? Like we've seen, Congress has been taking some, figurative scalps recently with the presidents of Penn and MIT and Harvard having gone before the same House committee and had disastrous sound bites come out of there where they're not able to say whether or not calls for genocide are protected, or they're giving these very legalistic answers that sound very divorced from the humanity that most people would like to see, and divorced from, sounding like people that really care about free expression on their campus. Those presidents, didn't give the right answer. Here now we have, they gave the right answer legally, but they didn't give the right answer that all of us felt like was the obvious answer. That said, it was legally correct. Now we have Manoush Shafik saying, I will punish, quote unquote, calls for genocide, up to and including from the river to the sea, divorced of any kind of conduct that would actually make it actionable discriminatory harassment. She's suggesting that she is willing to punish things like people saying intifada with just on its own, which on its own, intifada from the river to the sea, without any other facts that would suggest it's crossed the line into a threat or discriminatory harassment. That is totally protected political speech under Columbia's very clear, and decades-old free expression policies. So I think the pressure here to silence this particular pro-Palestinian speech is there, and she suggested to Congress that she's not just willing to do it, but may have already been investigating some faculty, some students. So again, we're working very hard to figure out what the facts are here and if there really is protected speech being punished at Columbia. Again, the tricky thing here is with that encampment, legally, they don't have the legal right to camp out all day and night, but if they're letting, if Columbia in the past has let other groups do that, then we have, again, questions about viewpoint discrimination.
So drill down on that one point, though, about the Charlottesville. I mean, people are curious. In that instance, it was, I believe, Proud Boys, an explicitly white supremacist group. There is no kind of tea reading about what the agenda is there, saying Jews will not replace us, having tiki torches. Are you aware if there was any similar investigation into their background, or whether or not there were any kind of academic expulsions, like the likes of which we've seen here, suspensions for anybody involved in that particular protest? And again, notably, someone was actually killed as a consequence of those protests, Heather Heyer.
Right. I'm not aware of that. What I will say is that, we were, we as FIRE were, have had the same messaging for many years. Like, once something crosses the line into a true threat or discriminatory harassment, it's not protected, and it shouldn't be. Now, when it comes to what happened at Charlottesville, obviously, like you said, someone was killed there. This is a very serious situation. We don't want to see anything like that happening at Columbia or on any of our campuses. So it is very important when there are allegations of violence or true threats that we do have authorities there, that police and campus safety are there to stop these types of things before they get out of control. Again, you're right. We have not seen that level of violence as far as we can tell on campuses. Instead, it looks like, by and large, peaceful protest that is, civil disobedience, or peaceful protest when people are moving after they've been told to evacuate certain areas. So a mix of peaceful protest and civil disobedience. But, the people, again, in the encampment that were told to move, or the people that, last night were surrounding NYU were told to move, they're engaging in civil disobedience. The point of civil disobedience is I am willing to be arrested or face institutional consequences because I feel so deeply about this particular cause. But of course, consequences are there. We're also working to make sure that students do know what their rights are when it comes to peaceful protest. How can students get their point across without having to go so far as getting themselves arrested? Obviously, being arrested is not ideal.
And Alex, can you speak to this call? We're seeing the ideas of setting up task force on anti-Semitism at various campuses, that kind of thing. And I find this so interesting because your group has done a lot of this work, and I've done a lot of reporting on it myself for Reason Magazine about how all these sort of hate crime, bias incidents, response team organizations on campuses have been disastrous for free speech over the last few decades, allowing students and faculty to investigate each other for personal slights, for other reasons, involving the police when they don't need to be involved an extraordinary number of times. And, I think if there is anti-Semitism on campus, certainly there is some of it, and speech against it is the right way to respond to it. But are some people now calling for the very policies that have chilled speech so often again on college campuses over the years?
Yeah, and from a lot of the groups that have been like, we're pro-free speech and we hate bias reporting, now they're wanting the same kinds of things for quote-unquote anti-Semitism. And of course, anti-Semitism is one of those things that, there's not a legal definition. There's the IHRA definition, which a lot of groups have used, but that definition was originally intended to measure anti-Semitism. And that can be totally, that might be totally legitimate, but when you convert that measurement definition into something that's used as a metric for institutional or government punishment, then we are poised to run afoul of the First Amendment, right? Because you have legislators who have different views on what's anti-Semitism, implementing this very squishy definition that's, a certain perception of Jews. That is incredibly vague, incredibly overbroad, and absolutely, poised to be abused. So we absolutely are reinforcing to schools that instead of implementing new bias reporting policies colored in with whatever shade the controversy is of the day, instead they need to really get away from those and return to educating students that they are bound to encounter views they disagree with during a robust and full college education. And certainly universities can, should, must act when speech turns into conduct that is discriminatory harassment, severe, pervasive, targeted conduct that's so serious that, the student victim is not able to access an educational benefit. But that's really rare. Instead, what we see more often reported are, some student said something on Twitter I don't like, or a faculty member said something in class that I personally found offensive. That's not going to meet that discriminatory harassment bar. We need to get away from this, campus climate of finding people, looking for the next student who has slighted me so that I can report them to the administration, and instead realize that the very people you disagree with are the ones you need to engage with and convince if you want to really get your point across and have your point, become more prominent. So we need students to understand the benefits and the necessity of learning to engage with views they disagree with.
Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much to you both.